Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Theater You're Live. Oh, and YouTube just kicked in, so I'll do it again. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 8:30 Live. It is me, your friend, Ben Yee. Unless you're watching somebody else's live, in which case it might not be me. No promises. In any event, I'm going to go ahead and click some buttons and do the sharing while folks are alerted that the live is going. We're doing the podcast, or trying at least. Again, people have been favoriting my podcast. I don't have a podcast. So I figured that if people are favoriting it, I should probably start making one. Okay, so since I talk every night, I figured, why the hell? How much harder can it be? How much more work can it be than to do the YouTube live and the Facebook live and now the podcast live? Seems like it's going okay. In any event, let me just click this button. And okay, folks are starting to tune in. I figure there's some really interesting things happening in the world. Well, I suppose people have. But remember how we had a discussion not too long ago about QAnon? Well, apparently the QAnon folks are really, really making moves. And we're going to get into that, but we're going to get into that last because it's quite a discussion. It tells us a lot about the direction of the Republican Party. And honestly, the Tea Party, which I think is a really great example of how one political entity becomes another, might just be morphing into the QAnon cohort. And I think this is quite dangerous. But first, let's just talk about some basic things. Headlines, short, quick things that folks should know about. First, Yankee Stadium, apparently it's being converted to a drive-through this summer. So that should be awesome if you have a car, which, I don't think a lot of New Yorkers do. But that being said, if you have a car and you're so inclined, they will be having movies and concerts in Yankee Stadium. Now, I've always wanted to go to Yankee Stadium and have a reason to go there. And I've always wanted to go on the field. So this could be a perfect opportunity. Obviously, I'm not going to go watch the Yankees. Baseball is the slowest, most boring sport. But to go watch a movie in a car, on the lawn, or on the field, that could be a thing. Some more tidbits of news before we get into some deeper stuff. Just so that folks know, China is definitely coming out to be the global hegemon as the United States advocates all leadership in the world. They announced the other day that whatever vaccine China creates, and who knows if they'll get there first, but if they do, or I suppose even if they get there second, they'll continue this policy. They promise that whatever vaccine they produce will be a public good, which basically means they'll provide it for free to everyone. Now, in addition to this, they've also promised $2 billion to the WHO. Now, for reference, the WHO's entire budget is about $6 billion. So a third of the WHO's budget is now being funded by China. And this is in comparison to the United States, which just pulled out of funding the WHO to the tune of $500 million. That's how much the United States was kicking in. Now, $2 billion is way beyond China's commitment level relative to the size of its economy and role in the WHO. And the United States is the largest contributor. So this $2 billion pledged by China is way beyond China's commitment, and it's actually well beyond the United States' commitment to the WHO. So China stepping up here to say that it's going to be a global leader, not just insofar as the most advanced technology or the largest economy, but actually taking on a leadership role of demonstrating what it means to be a good member in the Society of Nations. China coming out here. And I wonder if all of the folks who are terrified of communism and constantly pointing at China and all of these red countries, I wonder if they all realize that Donald Trump's foreign policy is the single greatest purveyor and supporter of communist hegemonic rule in the world right now. Because of Donald Trump, communist countries, a Soviet communist country like China and ex-communist countries like Russia can run around filling in power voids that the United States has created. But whatever. Let's just move on to the next thing, because I don't want to get bogged down in these global politics. Oh, but Matt Kozlowski has a question. Yankee Stadium is going to be a drive-in movie theater? Yes, No word yet on what they'll actually be showing there, but there was an article that said not just movie theater, but also concerts. So you might want to get yourself a car so you can drive in there and tear up that lawn. And I think somebody else said something, but nope. Oh yeah, Simon said, hi, Ben. Hi, Simon. Always a pleasure to see you. Now, Deidre Levy happens to be watching, and Deidre did ask me to address something yesterday, and I promised I would look into it, and I did. And in fact, it's some really, really important information. So I'm going to share it with everybody right now. And that information is that the, why am I so bad? Oh, great. And as the numbers tick up, I'm just here looking at my notes. Okay, this is, there it is. Okay, important information time. The Coronavirus Pandemic Electronic Benefit Transfer, or PEBT, is coming to New York. What does this mean? Well, basically, because of the federal school lunch program, for all of the days that schools were closed, the federal government is just giving the money that would have gone for school lunches directly to families. So for every child, for every day that a school was closed, a family is receiving about $5.70. Now, because New York City has a universal no-ask policy for school lunches, every child is entitled to one. That means every single family that's in a school which participates in the federal school lunch program, which is more than just the public schools. It includes some parochial schools and private schools. Every child who goes to school there will be receiving an electronic debit card, essentially, that has $5.70 for every day a school was closed in New York City. And that basically amounts to some $420. So these cards should be arriving sometime in June. And again, every single family with a child is entitled to $420 roughly per kid. And this is because of the school lunches that they weren't receiving because they couldn't go to school. That being said, New York City has continued to give out both breakfasts and lunches, and actually a third meal, so long as you could hold off on eating. Well, I mean, they were giving people 3 meals, a breakfast, a lunch, and then something else in between the hours of 8 a.m. and I think 1:30 p.m. So New York City has continued to provide food to families and any single hungry individual who wants what they happen to be giving out that day. And there's a school near me, and it looks like the options generally range from tuna fish, some kind of cheese sandwich, peanut butter and jelly, and occasionally like a bologna thing. I have never had it, but that's what I heard people being offered when they went. You don't get every option every day, but that's the deal. However, regardless of the fact that New York City has continued to give out free food every single day, you have to go to the school to pick it up. Every single family, again, will be receiving a debit card from the federal government for about $420 for every child. So that's pretty great. And actually, a special facet of this program is that it does not distinguish based on immigration status, nor does it count towards being a, quote, public charge. Now, these are two really, really important distinctions because, one, a lot of the coronavirus pandemic relief has been excluded or has excluded immigrants. So you might have heard stories about American citizens who are married to undocumented immigrants who were barred from receiving their $1,200 pandemic compensation, economic stimulus check because they happen to be married to undocumented immigrants. Well, these $420 do not distinguish based on your immigration status. Secondly, accepting this money doesn't make you a public charge. Now, what's a public charge? A public charge is an individual who receives benefits from the government. This could be Medicare, Medicaid, any sort of food stamps or SNAP program benefits. If you receive benefits from any of those programs, you are deemed a public charge. And the Trump administration has been attempting to use the public charge rolls to disqualify people from becoming citizens. So basically, the Trump administration is trying to say anybody who's a mooch, who's eating up tax dollars, and by the way, being a public charge does not mean that you take more in public services than you give in tax revenue. It's possible to use a government program, for example, SCHIP, which is healthcare for children, and not be indigent. In any event, the Trump administration has created new rules around issuing visas and enhancements to immigration status that bar people receiving public benefits and are public charges. The $420 coming from the federal government that makes up for the lack of school lunches provided does not qualify for distribution under the public charge rule. So every family should feel absolutely comfortable accepting this money and spending this money. It's owed to them by the federal government because that government failed to provide lunches or was incapable of providing lunches at schools while schools were closed for the pandemic. So that's actually a very important thing to point out. And thank you very much, Deidre, for bringing this to my attention last night so I could look into it for today. Okay, now a few more things. Just a top line thing so that folks know, we are now up to almost 40 million people filing for unemployment benefits in this country, which, we're rapidly approaching these Great Depression numbers where, the Great Depression had many, many different years and months of unemployment statistics. What people cite is this sort of peak of 25 or 30% unemployment. We are working our way up there. So just something to keep in the back of your minds. We are not yet out of the woods. In fact, we're walking into the woods. And unfortunately, the Trump administration seems to have taken away our lantern and our axe. So we're going into the woods with nothing, and it's dark. You are welcome, Deidre. Again, thank you for sharing that information about the Coronavirus Pandemic Electronic Benefit Transfer Program. Okay. Another thing that I would like to point out, and this is the last thing before we get to the QAnon thing, and just so that folks know, the QAnon discussion is going to be about actual QAnon people running for Congress and possibly winning, which is terrifying. We'll get into it. All right. The last thing I wanted to mention is just that, several states have reopened. Folks are going back to work, and they're also going back to malls and bars and such. And I just wanted people to know, because it didn't seem like it really made the news. We have already had our first shooting since people have begun congregating again. Yes, that's right. Getting back to normal in America means going back to people getting shot. I wonder what would happen if we just added on all of the gun deaths to the coronavirus deaths for people violating stay-at-home orders. But that being said, there was a mall shooting, or actually it's unclear to me whether this is a mall, but it was in Arizona at the Westgate Entertainment District. 3 were injured, one of whom is in critical condition. The shooter was a 20-year-old named Armando Hernandez, who had felt he had been bullied. And of course, the first thing you want to do when you got a lockdown and you see a bunch of people is shoot up the joint. So that's the America we live in. Just remember that when all of this crisis is over, we're going to have to deal with all of the crises we haven't dealt with. That includes gun violence, healthcare, although this is sort of a healthcare situation, but a different type of healthcare, just people regularly going bankrupt from healthcare costs, the environment, and a coterie, a variety of things which simply didn't get dealt with. And honestly, we're being exacerbated by the Trump administration, but we sort of forgot about because of impeachment and coronavirus and basically the nature of 2020. In any event, let's talk a little bit about this QAnon thing, because one of the things I often talk about when I do civics classes is the Tea Party and how completely effective they were in taking over the Republican Party. And I talk about that because when people try to make the case that change is impossible in the United States and that they don't want to partake in the party system because it's all corrupt, and that there's no way for regular people to be heard, I like to remind them that the Tea Party basically completely destroyed the establishment of the Republican Party. And they did it in some very concrete and easily identifiable ways. Now, yeah, some of it was the fact that as the Tea Party picked up steam, they were funded by billionaires and the whole thing was astroturfed. But astroturfing does provide resources, but at the same time, the tactics are the same as grassroots organizing. AstroTurfing isn't the same as establishment politics. It requires a different approach, which involves organizing people on the ground and ensuring that they understand the system and run for small offices to create a bench of people to run for larger offices. And then knowing that whether or not you actually manage to win a majority of seats, or really very many seats, you can scare politicians into doing what you want just by the threat of a challenge in an election. So with that basis, with that context, I would like to talk about QAnon and Oregon, because there is a woman there, Jo Rae Perkins, who just won the Republican primary for the U.S. Senate. That's big. That's gigantic. She was running for a congressional district, then switched over to the Senate race, and she won in a four-way race. And it looks like she's going to get just about 50% of the vote in a four-way race running on a QAnon platform. Now, we've spoken about QAnon before and various other conspiracy theories and the Boogaloo and all of these other things. And I just want to recap briefly how QAnon works. Actually, let me just define what the Boogaloo is for those who don't know. The Boogaloo is the second Civil War. It draws its name from Breaking 2, Electric Boogaloo, which was, as it sounds, a sequel to Breaking 1. I don't think it had a subtitle. So the Boogaloo is the second Civil War. QAnon is not really about the Boogaloo, but it's not independent from the Boogaloo per se. The followers of Q are not necessarily opposed to a second Civil War. And actually, many of them are prepared to take up arms and fight the Second World War or even undertake terrorist activity. So you might remember Pizzagate, where there was a claim that there was an underground pedophile ring underneath a pizza in the basement of a pizza parlor in Washington, D.C. that was linked to Hillary Clinton and John Podesta, and somebody showed up there with a gun. There have been several folks who espouse or have been proponents of the QAnon theory who have certainly exhibited violent tendencies. Now, that being said, the general QAnon thesis is that there is a war amongst the elite, and that these hyper elite are fighting over a resource known as adrenochrome, which is a hallucinogen, a hallucinogen, and it's something you get from human blood. And so their entire theory is that there's a cabal of elites and there's a massive conspiracy to kidnap and abuse children so that they can drink their blood effectively. Now, this is tied into Epstein, which is why they'll oftentimes point to Alex Jones, who was calling out the Epstein stuff and Epstein's pedophile tendencies before Epstein actually went down. It's tied into Podesta and the Clintons and all of this stuff. It was tied into the Mercy, which was the hospital ship sent to New York. The point is, these QAnon folks view Donald Trump as the spearhead of a psyop, of a military psyop to finally expose the elite and arrest all of them. All right. So if that sounded confusing and not utterly convincing, there's a reason for that. That's because there's not an awful lot to back up the assertions of the QAnon crowd. And most of their information comes from Q, which is an anonymous tipster in the intelligence community, or maybe high up in the military, or maybe Donald Trump himself, who releases little fragments about this conspiracy onto the internet. And every time something comes out, they have to parse what that information is trying to tell them, and then piece together this elaborate conspiracy that's going on with these fragments of information. Now, it is unclear in reality whether Q is one person, multiple people, whatever. And it's certainly unclear whether Q is actually somebody who's in the intelligence community or military. There's zero validation for that, other than the fact that people believe it must be so because of all of the secrets Q is unveiling. Now, why is this important? It's important because this is a conspiracy which really, really places the followers of Q on one side of history and everybody else on the other side. The followers of Q are heroes. They are uncovering and unraveling the thread of a deep, deep conspiracy of the elite. And everybody else is either a sheep who's turning a blind eye or aiding this cabal, which is really there to victimize children and amass power. Which brings us back to Jo Rae Perkins, who is again running for the US Senate on the platform of QAnon, right? QAnon being QAnonymous. She is running to say that there is a massive conspiracy out there that the elite are actively kidnapping and torturing children and doing terrible, horrible things to them and murdering people. And she has received almost 50% of the vote in the Republican primary in Oregon. That means she's going to go and she's going to run against the Democrat in a legitimate general election. And again, she ran against 4 other people. So this wasn't some uncontested primary. She came out of this thing in a real slugfest, and she's going to win it, it looks like. Now, to give you a little background on who Jo Rae Perkins is, aside from being a supporter of QAnon, she is the former chair of the Lynn County Republican Party. Now, I really want to drive this home. In New York, basically everywhere in this country, there are local party committees, and there are low levels of government like school boards and water boards and highway superintendents and dog catchers. And the people who really move parties in a particular direction are the people who occupy those low-level seats. Not just because those low-level seats have their own influence, which they do, but also because this creates a base on which they can run later. So well before QAnon was a thing, Jo Rae Perkins was a leader in the local Republican establishment. She had, cut her teeth on local elections. She knew how campaigns worked. And now that QAnon is a thing, and she wants to know whether or not the QAnon people are out there and will support her, she has what it takes to put together, apparently, a winning effort. Now, she probably has a lot of great connections from her times as chair of the Lynn County Republican Party. Maybe not. But certainly, it is these local institutions that are breeding grounds for new leadership. And so for anybody out there who's not familiar with their county committee, who wants to join, who doesn't know what a district leader is, I highly reach out to me. I highly encourage you to get plugged in, because this is how politics changes over time, mainly through the flipping and movement of political parties. Like, where has the main dynamic been in the United States policymaking for the last 100 years? It's been in the flip and movement of the political parties themselves. We don't have different political parties from what we had in the Civil War. The political parties have shifted position time and time again, so that the Democrats, which were once the party of the slaveholders, and the Republicans, which were once the abolitionists, have changed places. Now, there are many times and on many issues where you can watch the parties shift and realign the electorate. And this is where changes occur in the American political landscape. We don't have a huge, fractious, multi-party system that lends itself to coalition building. Instead, we have 2 large parties, and the coalitions form within them. And then major events completely shift who is within each party and where each party aligns on each issue. So the Civil War, for example, Republicans, abolitionists, Democrats, slaveholders. Fast forward to the 1960s, things have changed over time. There have been some realignments. Voting Rights Act, Lyndon Baines Johnson, Democrat, signs the law that enables African Americans in the South to vote effectively. And he says it as he signs it. We've handed the South to the Republicans for a generation. As it turns out, much more than a generation, but that was a seismic shift. COVID-19, Donald Trump, now you have a massive realignment again of the electorate. And actually, I missed one in there, which was in the Nixon-Reagan era. You had the realignment of the Republican Party to pick up the Southern strategy, to pick up evangelicals in the South and double down on the fact that Democrats had abandoned that constituency when they signed the VRA. So these dynamics are super important, and the party politics are super important. And the Tea Party understood that. They ran people for county leadership, for state party leadership, as well as for local government positions like water board and education board or education school district member or whatever it's called where you live. And that's how you got people running for Congress. Now, the QAnon folks are doing the same thing. Again, this woman was the chair of the Lynn County Party, and there's dozens of QAnon folks mounting bids for congressional seats all around the country this year, according to Media Matters. Now, I want to say one last thing about the value of organization and moving parties as opposed to trying to change politics. When you are an elected official, it is a very dicey situation. There is a lot of uncertainty in politics because one day you might be right on an issue and suddenly the next day that issue has flipped and you are wrong on that issue. Now, the number one way to remove uncertainty from an election is to have no opponents. This is why politicians challenge others to make the ballot. So when you gather your signatures, a politician or a competing candidate will challenge your signatures or challenge your right to be on the ballot so that you are knocked off. If you are knocked off, you can't run. It's even better than being a better candidate, having more money, being, quote, the establishment. If nobody's running against you, it's impossible to lose. And many, many elections in this country have only one candidate. So when folks in the Tea Party started petitioning to put folks on the ballot, and one or two of them won their elections, it put everybody else in the Republican Party on notice, you can lose. And in order to prevent losing, they didn't just try to out-organize the Tea Party. They decided to shift further to the right to prevent the Tea Party from primarying them. That is what the QAnon folks are doing. They are primarying Republicans all around the country, pushing them to adopt QAnon views. And if some of them win, one, those will be spokespeople for the QAnon conspiracy theory, and two, it will worry Republican leaders and Republican elected officials that they need to appease the QAnon constituency in order to retain their seats reliably. And I say reliably because it doesn't mean they need to appease that constituency to retain their seats. They might be able to just straight beat these people in an election if they do the work. But if they want to win reliably and not have to work hard, it's a lot easier to just say some random stuff to appease the most vocal constituents of your party. So this is actually, I think, a really important dynamic that's taking place right now, and it's not something that we should be sleeping on. It's not something we can afford to sleep on because these QAnon folks view Donald Trump as savior, as the only person who's capable of combating the, quote, deep state and of taking down the establishment elite, which are preying upon the most vulnerable in our society. They view themselves as the light army or army of light or, the good guys. They view everybody else as the bad guys, and they would like nothing more than a military coup to install President Trump as president for life, because they view Donald Trump as an outsider who is taking on the vested interests that, again, are preying on the vulnerable in our society. If these people start winning elections on the QAnon platform, it is a really, really bad sign as far as I'm concerned. And as I've mentioned before when discussing QAnon, I know QAnon pretty well because I used to have somebody on my Facebook, and somebody that I hung out with for some time before the Q stuff started, who is a huge QAnon proponent. I've looked into QAnon a lot. I've been fed a lot of QAnon things. Their beliefs really would say that if you have a Congress with a few senators who are QAnoners, they're going to be the kinds of people who appoint judges that remove executive power. They're going to be the sorts of people who start lobbying for a third term of Donald Trump. It's not a good situation. And again, I can't stress this enough. This person who ran on the QAnon platform looks set to win the Republican primary for a Senate seat. So this is something I think that we should all be aware of. It didn't make, big news. It's not like the New York Times is picking this up, or this is in the Atlantic. Maybe I should write something, because I think this is pretty important. People dismissed the Tea Party when it was coming up, but the Tea Party was rabid and dedicated. And it had funding for millionaires and billionaires because it had this whole tax component to it. But mostly it had people who were ready to do the grunt work and infiltrate the party and manipulate the system. And it looks like the QAnon folks are ready to do the same. And they have some people who have some political background. Again, Joe Ray Perkins, who was chair of a Republican county party. So with that, I'm going to go. I know there were some comments that I missed, but I really wanted to go into how the political dynamics of the United States work. And I understand that the left has a lot of problems with the Democratic Party. I also understand that, it's not cool to work within the structure. However, those people who have been most successful have been the ones working within the structure. And again, moving the parties one way or the other, not somehow externally changing the political dynamic of the United States. And yeah, we gave a whole example of that, so I'm not going to do it again, but these are things we need to be cognizant of. Okay, Deidre Levy, but there was another shooting on the Upper West Side. Okay, so we spoke about the shooting in Arizona at the at the Westgate Entertainment District. Apparently there was another shooting on the Upper West Side, Deidre says, and I think that was because of a lack of mental support, domestic violence due to COVID-19. Entirely possible. Man killed in NYC police-involved shooting. Thank you for the link, Deidre. Thank you for the information. Do you know if it was somebody who just went to a public space to shoot random people? Because this, certainly we have a huge situation of gun violence in the United States and domestic violence in the United States, both of which intertwine to create a very dangerous situation for people at home. But this is still different from the mass shooting or public shooting phenomenon that is very unique to the United States, which is people going to places with the intent of shooting lots of people they don't know. And this individual who was apprehended, who's the main suspect, I mean, this person confessed, but not convicted, so suspect, which is how we should do, innocent until proven guilty and all that. But Armando Hernandez said that he had gone with the intention of shooting at least 10 people. Again, he only got 3, still one of whom's in critical condition, but this was, our definition of a mass shooting is 10 people, I believe, but this was an intended mass shooting. That was the intention here. So I would draw a distinction there between these private shootings and these public shootings, because they really have different dynamics insofar as individuals have disputes at home. There is domestic violence, of course, and it's terrible when folks have guns and people get killed and there are shootings like this. But it's a different phenomenon from the fact that there are just assault weapons floating around and anybody can pick one up and go shoot 10 people without provocation. All right, Daniel Ezra Moraf, NRM.org. Unfortunately, there's no indication in the URL of what that's about. So if you could say something, or I'll check it out and maybe talk about it on the live tomorrow. Ross Dakin says, yo, Ross Dakin. I don't know if you're still there, but it is awesome to see you. James Morris King, love me some QAnon chat. QAnon is just absolutely fascinating. It's so deep, and the details are so sparse that it leaves so much room for just interpretation. And again, sometimes I can't tell from what I read whether or not what they're claiming is mystical in nature or not. So like adrenochrome. So the connection to this is really about these pedophile rings, right? The QAnon folks are absolutely obsessed with pedophile rings, and they view Jeffrey Epstein as actual proof that QAnon is right. And the murder of Jeffrey Epstein I'm sorry. The fact that Jeffrey Epstein died under mysterious circumstances in his cell really feeds the QAnon conspiracy theory, because when I say that they believe the elites prey on the most vulnerable, what they really, like, the core of this is that they are running pedophile kidnapping rings to take young children, abuse them, particularly sexually abuse them, for their own depraved pleasure. And then, because that abuse triggers the release of adrenochrome, to then kill these children, drink their blood, and get high on that drug. And the last time we spoke about this and really went into the far-right conspiracy theories, including the Boogaloo and QAnon and the militia movement, it was stated that adrenochrome is a real thing, but that it's not the thing that the QAnon folks think it is. But I've heard everything from QAnon as an amazing psychedelic, that's what it was, not hallucinogen, psychedelic, to maybe it grants you immortality if you drink enough of it. Very unclear. And so there's so much to this. There's so much down the rabbit hole of the QAnon stuff. And there are all of these claims about the deep state and the factions of the elite, the intelligence community versus the military versus the tech bros. It's incredibly intricate, and folks can get lost down all of these rabbit holes. And there's so much information out there that leads you on a chase, and then little bits of corroborating evidence, little bits of corroborating information, again, like the Jeffrey Epstein component, that really start to make you think, oh, could this be legit? And the minute you accept it's legit, you can be a hero. And you can be a hero by supporting Donald Trump and supporting Donald Trump objectives, like opposing vote by mail, a third term for the president, locking up and arresting all of his political opponents. Because the idea behind QAnon is that Donald Trump is either the leader of or a puppet of, doesn't really matter, the good guys, which are the folks who are inside the government, who know that the leadership is corrupt and are combating that leadership, managed to install Donald Trump against the wishes of the cabal, or, the conspiratorial hierarchy, which were trying to put Hillary Clinton into power against the wishes of the public. You know how it is. And then that Donald Trump, being the good guy, is there to expose this massive conspiracy and fraud, and to take it one step further, arrest all of them and possibly execute all of them. And so the QAnon folks will literally cheer if Donald Trump gets a third term. Donald Trump starts rounding up his political opponents. Donald Trump starts executing people who oppose him, because in their view, Donald Trump is the only safeguard against a cabal that is there to terrorize and sexually abuse children the globe over. And anything he does is in the service of taking down these elites. And that includes extrajudicial killing of the type that Donald Trump has praised from Philippines President Duterte. to have people like that running for Congress and legitimately winning primaries for a major political party is not something we should take lightly. Just remember what happened the last time somebody who wasn't supposed to win an election won the nomination of a major political party. That person became president of the United States. And that is why we have QAnon folks moving into Congress, or potentially moving into Congress, but certainly contesting congressional races all around the country by the dozens. Folks, you heard it here first. Or maybe not, but probably. Deirdre Levy, another comment. So this is going back to the shooting. It was believed to be an off-duty MTA worker who apparently shot his sister-in-law. He would not put down the knife when approached by police. Then police shot him. Wait, so is he a shooter, or did the police shoot him? Because while police should not go around shooting people, and obviously that's another huge crisis, which we're not resolving because of all the other crises we face, and we spoke about that a little bit earlier. Even though we do have a crisis of police shooting folks, I would say that a knife threatening of somebody that you know is, again, a separate problem from the ready access to firearms, which allow people to perpetrate mass shootings. And again, this is in reference to the Arizona Westgate Entertainment District shooting, where even though only 3 people were shot, it was stated by the shooter that the goal was to get at least 10. At least 10, like it's some sort of game. So that's all the comments, and that's pretty much everything I wanted to cover today. I hope that was interesting for everybody. It certainly is always fun for me. Now let's do the Magna Carta, because I think Dorian's here, and actually I've been having a pretty good time reading through the Magna Carta and talking about its influences and implications for Enlightenment thinking and for the foundations of the U.S. Constitution and the way it impacted the framers of this country. So we've already basically read their preamble, which is all of them listing all their names. We've read their first section, which is giving a bunch of rights to God, which is effectively the opposite of the First Amendment of the Constitution. We read their second section about the rights of earls and barons who have received land from the monarch to pass down and retain ownership of those lands so long as they pay a relief, or essentially a state tax, so that they could have propagation and growth of wealth generation over generation. And we spoke about the section which guarantees that wards incapable or not old enough to manage these estates would still be entitled to inherit the estates so long as there was a guardian appointed, and then they would inherit their estates upon coming to age. Okay, so these really laid some... Now, this maybe all sounds very boring and normal, that, lords would be able to just sort of take whatever land they have and pass it on to their children. But this is actually... The Magna Carta was written because at the time, you had absolute monarchy, and the king, queen, whoever was in charge, the government could simply come and take anybody's property if it so desired, right? So this was guaranteeing property rights to the church. It was guaranteeing titles to the bishops. It was guaranteeing land and ownership of that land to the lords, that the king could not take away, either to punish them or to enrich himself. And we spoke really at length 2 nights ago about how economic historians view that as a critical step towards capitalism, market economies, and innovation and industrialization. We compared it to the economic system of China at the time and drew some distinctions as to why their economies and, honestly, their industrial bases and technology might have developed differently because of these guaranteed rights in the Magna Carta. Now, the Magna Carta, again, circa 1215. So let's read section 4. No, wait, sorry, not 4. 4 we did last time. Let's do 5. And I suppose 6, because 6 is very short. By the way, we are nowhere near close to the end of this thing. This thing is quite long. So we'll be at this for a while. I mean, not tonight, but broken up overnights. For so long as a guardian has guardianship of such land, the land of an heir who is too young to inherit, he shall remain the houses, parks, fish preserves, ponds, mills, and everything else pertaining to it from the revenues of the land itself. When the heir comes of age, he shall restore the whole land to him, stocked with plow teams and such implements of husbandry as the season demands and the revenues of the land can reasonably bear. 6. Heirs may be given in marriage, but not to someone of lower social standing. Before a marriage takes place, it shall be made known to the heirs next of kin. So this is actually some interesting. I mean, this sort of builds just on what we were saying. This is obviously the Magna Carta isn't broken into sections the way the U.S. Constitution is, pertaining to different topics of concern. So the Constitution, for example, is broken into Article 1, 2, and 3, which are the various branches of government, legislature, executive, and judiciary. And then there are, of course, the amendments which were tacked on. The Magna Carta is a singular document, which is just sort of word vomit, delineating all the things that these folks agreed to. Now, we are obviously in the section on the rights of earls and barons, particularly pertaining to their land, and the rights of their kin to inherit. So basically, what we've just heard is that if a ward, an heir which has not come of age and cannot manage their own land, if a ward cannot inherit the land, then there shall be a guardian, and that guardian is required under the law to properly manage the affairs of the estate, and then to return that land to the proper owner of that estate to run the land. And that furthermore, all of the revenues of that land is to go towards the maintenance of that land. Now you might think, well, this is boring and unimportant and rather straightforward, but it's what we should. It's that old adage. It's that old adage that if there's a warning for it, it's because somebody did it, right? If they're writing this down in the Magna Carta, which is the seminal document which makes the United Kingdom a constitutional monarchy, this is the central document constraining the power of the monarch. What it would imply or indicate is that prior to this document, on many occasions, the land was either taken by the monarch or taken into trust by the monarch, or the land was given a governor by the monarch, which oversaw it and either extracted all of the value from it or failed to return it, or failed to return it in good keeping to the heir when that heir came of age. So all of this is delineating all of the things that the monarch would do and the things that they want to keep the monarch from doing in the future. And I really want to say this because libertarians will talk about the power of the government and how all the government does is coerce and blah, blah, blah. It's really important to understand that those are things the government did. The monarch used to steal things from other people. Have you ever heard of First Night? I forget what it's called. I think it's called First Night or something. It used to be, I think it was in Britain as well as other places. If you got married, the lord of the manor or the monarch had the first right. Oh, his first rights, and it was the right of the lord of the man or the monarch to come and sleep with your wife before you, right after you got married, per their discretion. There were all sorts of things that monarchs did and that the government did. And when we say monarchs and we say kings, a lot of times, we disassociate that. It's like, oh, kings are bad, monarchs are bad. What libertarians and what the Enlightenment thinkers and what the founders of the United States understood it as was the government, because the king is the government. The lordship, the feudal structure, that's the government. They are the people who exercise that monopoly on force and decide what is and is not allowed and maintain that through arms. So when we read all of these little things, this is really a delineation of grievances and things which people felt they had to write down so that some dick monarch, some king wouldn't come along and do these super annoying, super terrible things to other people. Now, mind you, these are the most privileged people. So far, we've read nothing about the peasantry. And I imagine there's nothing about the peasantry in here. These are all about the rights of the most privileged people, the lords and the barons, which says, one, two things. Yes, society was highly stratified and unequal. But two, that the constraint on government is something which didn't exist for anybody. Even the most privileged people didn't have what we would consider the basic rights. You might think of lords and ladies as having some degree of power or insulation, but at the end of the day, whoever was the monarch, the king or queen, held ultimate authority and could do whatever they want until this minor revolution or bloodless revolution or whatever it was, whatever they want to call it in England. They like to call it a bloodless revolution, or they like to say we've never had a civil war. Yeah. Whatever they want to say, the power of the monarch wasn't constrained until this came along, except by norms and traditions. And we're experiencing now just how powerful those norms and traditions are when you have somebody who doesn't really respect them. So this is actually quite interesting. And it talks about marriage as well. And the fact that heirs or wards, because now they've got a guardian that's the heirs of these estates, but these wards, they're wards of these guardians who are overseeing the estates, they could be married off because that was the practice of the time. But, and this is really interesting, I think, and critical, the next of kin would have to be informed. So what that implies is that the government would come in, the government, right? Child services, effectively, in ye old England, but child services under the aegis of the monarchy would come in and basically, or somebody else would come in who was posing as acting in the best interests of the Lord's heir and would marry that person off for whatever reason, maybe to get rid of them, possibly, and then have the estate granted to themselves, maybe to marry them off to an ally of theirs. Maybe they would marry this person themselves and inherit this land. So the point here is that the notification of the next of kin is really not for, it's to ensure that there's a second order of observance and oversight over what this guardian is doing. So they can't just do what they please with this other person's life, as well as with their land. So I actually think that this says this is we're beginning to draw out these ideas. Now remember, this is pre-Enlightenment. This is this is pre-individualism. What we're beginning to draw out here is the fact that individuals have rights and you can't just treat them willy-nilly. They happen to be lords, they happen to be whatever. They're not, again, we're not talking about peasants here, but these were ideas which were just formulating. The ideas that people were individual of the state, that not everything belonged to the collective, that the structure of society and the people who govern society have limits in what they can do, and that the people who live in that society are entitled to not be married off without, some adults who are relatives of theirs weighing in on the matter or at least knowing about it. Because everything up until this moment has been about property, about land, which is an important thing. And it's a thing that, people talk a lot about, particularly in the Constitution and whatever. This is about an individual's life and, to some degree, their self-determination. They can't just be married. They can be married off, but not without the input of more than this guardian. So it's protecting something that's beyond property, that's maybe approaching, maybe we'll see, approaching that sense of pursuit of happiness later on down the line. Admitting, of course, that it still does allow for the marrying off of somebody, because that's just how things went down back in the 1200s. Anyway, tomorrow we'll return to read some more of the Magna Carta and investigate its influences on our society today and our institution's roots in English law and culture. Until then, I'll see you tomorrow.